Good morning, everyone. Let's take a look at some ongoing updates as it relates to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. I'm recording this at 8:30 a.m. Central on Sunday, October 15th, 2023. So by the time this video goes up, there might be additional updates beyond what we're covering here. So the Israeli Defense Force, for the second day in a row, has not put out their kind of graphic showing the various statistics and data points that they're tracking. We're able to gather some of that information from other sources. Israeli airstrikes have continued all across Gaza at a pretty significant clip. The IDF announced that Bilal al-Qedra was killed during one of these strikes, who was listed as the commander of the Southern Khan Yunis Nukba forces. Now, the way that would have been verified, of course, is not likely through people on the ground, but very easily could have been through signals intercepts. So maybe Israel was able to pick up chatter of Qedra, or maybe after the fact, they were able to intercept communications between different Hamas factions stating that one of their commanders was killed. The Gaza Health Ministry has put out that 2,300 Palestinians have been killed during this air war that Israel has conducted over Gaza, with an additional 9,000 wounded. Now, a couple quick notes on that. One, it's listed as the Gaza Health Ministry, but the only government structure, if you will, inside of Gaza is Hamas. So they are managing the flow of information coming out of there. That number is, I'm a little bit surprised at that number, to be honest. Given the volume of strikes in such a condensed area, I actually would have thought that number would be higher at this point, as awful as that sounds. It very well might speak to the tunnels all across Gaza and some of the shelters that Hamas has been able to build in to withstand some of these Israeli strikes. Another item, however, is just the vast amounts of rubble all across Gaza due to these strikes. Entirely possible that there's a lot of bodies that have not yet been recovered. In terms of the hostages, there's really not a lot of new information there. Israel put out a new graphic, which appears to show 31 nations, if I count correctly, that have hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Now, this, again, there's just not been a lot of information on this on the international stage, which has been surprising. I thought that we would hear a lot more outcry from the different nations shown on this graphic of trying to find ways to get their people home, and it just hasn't really been the case. That hasn't been front and center, not by a long shot. I don't know if the reason for that is that they feel like their hands are tied. Like, what are some of these nations going to do? Are they really going to show up in Gaza, put boots on the ground, while Israel has this area cordoned off? Not realistically. Right? Maybe they're providing support to Israel to try to get their people out, but nobody is going to go in over the top of Israel right now to try to extract some of their people. It's an active war zone. It's not feasible. But again, I thought we would see more in terms of statements or support to trying to get these hostages out of there. Now, the Al-Qassam Brigades, which is a Hamas affiliate, a group tied in with Hamas in Gaza, did claim that the Israeli airstrikes over the last 24 hours have killed 9 hostages, including 4 foreign nationals. They did not accompany this with videos or pictures, so impossible to confirm. But that is, from what I've seen, the first announcement by Hamas or a Hamas-affiliated group that any of these hostages have been killed. Now, the IDF continues to make preparations for what many believe, and I believe, is going to be a ground assault into Gaza. It's kind of expected any day now. The airstrikes are likely tied to a larger shaping operation, if you will, taking out command and control nodes, taking out facilities where Hamas would be able to conduct rocket strikes into Israel. IDF has said that this pending operation is likely to include components in air, land, and sea, which we've already seen to a degree, right? There are land-based firing into Gaza. There's, of course, an air war overhead, and there has been some footage coming out of Israeli naval forces identifying and destroying Hamas terrorist activity in the sea. Now, the IDF did put out yesterday that they had entered the territory of the Gaza Strip in a number of localized raids in order to both collect evidence and information about abducted Israelis, as well as to eliminate threats that could impede IDF activity. This was listed on one of the IDF readouts, one of their press releases, but that was the only place I saw it. This information if these raids were conducted, it doesn't look like there was any sort of kinetic activity. There was no violence in line with these raids. Really kind of flew under the radar. But from what I've seen, that's the first instance since October 7th of Israeli forces going into Gaza itself. Now, the IDF does continue to press forward the idea that all civilians need to evacuate Gaza to the south, and there were two pretty significant instances yesterday worth talking about. The first is that aerial or overhead imagery showed that Hamas had laid some roadblocks in the areas where the IDF laid out a couple paths, and they said these are a couple areas you can move south, you won't be targeted, you're free to move. And it looks like one of those, through some satellite imagery released by Israel, that some of those had roadblocks, and they identified those as being Hamas trying to prevent the civilians from fleeing the battlefield. We've talked about this previously, but it is in Hamas's best interest for civilians to be all throughout Gaza before, whether it's just Israeli airstrikes or if they move in on the ground. It makes it much harder for the IDF to actually conduct counterterrorism operations and round up Hamas leadership when there's civilians everywhere. So it is in Hamas's best interest for the civilians to stay. Additionally, there was an audio call that I'll play here where really it's just a Gaza civilian calling the IDF saying we can't get out. There's people stopping us, trying to prevent us from leaving. Here it is.
اللي بالضبط وين النقطة اللي وقفوكم؟
عند هيئة الوكالة وقفونا خلاص، ما كله ياخذوا هوياتهم ومفاتيحهم وكله السيارات.
يعني هذا تبع الحركة تبع الحماس؟
كله.
مين عم بيوقفكم؟ تبع الحماس؟
Of course, you have to take that with a grain of salt. Again, it's something that Israel decided to release. It's single source. We're only getting it from Israel. There's no way to verify the authenticity of that clip or what the individual on the other side is saying, but it does line up with some of the satellite imagery that's coming out as well. There's another big item where there was a lot of debate. There was an explosion on a path that civilians were using to travel south out of Gaza City, and people started diving into this right away. I'm not a forensic expert and able to really discern exactly what we saw here. I'll show some pictures. But some say that it was a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device or maybe just an IED laid on the side of the road. Others that it was an airstrike designed by Israel to target civilians as they're fleeing Gaza. In terms of official statements, the IDF addressed this earlier today in their daily briefing, saying that everything that they can see and just looking at the analysis from experts all around the world, it looks like an improvised explosive device that was already there or in a vehicle and not an aerial attack. But they did say, worth noting, quote, "We for sure did not strike on purpose. It may have been some sort of freak accident," which I doubt. That's the IDF spokesperson. And I thought it was interesting and worthwhile that they brought that up, recognizing the fog of war. They're not completely dismissing the fact that there's the possibility that an airstrike went errant, right? A lot of these GPS-guided and laser-guided bombs, we assume that every single time they're going to strike exactly where they hit. They don't. They miss. Fins don't deploy. There's malfunctions in the guidance systems. So while the majority of the evidence I've seen points towards an IED and not an airstrike, I thought it was worth noting that the IDF has not yet ruled out that it could have been an accident. But they are, of course, reiterating the fact that they are not targeting civilians. They want civilians to leave. It does not help their effort of getting civilians out of Gaza if they're targeting those locations that they're telling civilians to use. Now, moving into the broader escalation of this conflict, which on the one hand, it's been great that the war has not escalated any further. I remember as soon as this thing kicked off, there were concerns that it could spiral out of control. So on the one hand, good news, we're not there. However, things do continue to spike that potentially could lead us in that direction. So Iran yesterday put out a statement through the United Nations saying that there would be far-reaching consequences if Israel is not stopped. And if Israel were to go into Gaza on the ground, Iran would be forced to intervene. Now, this was an interesting statement being put out in the public because they're kind of drawing a red line on something that just about everybody feels is going to happen. I've seen very few folks suggest at this point that Israel is not going to move into Gaza itself. So Iran drew that line around something that seems imminent. Usually you don't see that just with most nations, right? They're kind of putting themselves in a box here where Israel is likely to go into Gaza, and then everybody's going to look at Iran and say, what are you going to do now? Especially the Iranian proxies and allies all throughout the region. They're kind of forcing themselves to act when eventually Israel does move into Gaza. Now, a couple quick notes on some of those Iranian proxies. The Washington Institute compiled a breakdown of kind of the public statements by some of these organizations in Iraq. You've got Asaib al-Haq, Kataib Hezbollah. We've got Hakarat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, Kataib Saeed al-Shuhada, and Kataib al-Iman Ali. All of those organizations, again, Iranian-backed, Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq, were very general. We support the Palestinian cause. We support Hamas. We'd like our people to send money and support to Hamas. Nothing crazy, kind of hedging their bets, if you will. But there was one group, the Badr organization, that came out a little more strongly. Their leader, Hadi al-Ameri, came out and said, quote, "Our stand is clear. If the Americans intervene in the battle with Hamas, we will attack all U.S. targets. Therefore, they need to stop the support for this Zionist entity." And that's likely what Iranian escalation would look like here, right? It's just much lower risk than firing missiles or launching aircraft to strike Israel itself. Iran just has so many of these proxies scattered all throughout the Middle East in areas where there's Israeli interests, American interests, or American troops on the ground in a lot of locations that would be targets for some of these organizations. Now, kind of continuing on that thread of regional escalation, there were reports yesterday that additional rockets were fired from Syria into Israel. Israel responded with counter-battery fire. Whether it's Syria, Iran, or Lebanon, Hezbollah at this point, technically the war has not formally expanded to any of those nations. But we are starting to see an increase in activity in Syria. Not just those strikes yesterday, but there was also an Israeli strike for the second time against the Aleppo airport. We've got some pictures here that show the damage to that facility or to one of those runways that supposedly put it out of commission. And the argument here for striking inside of Syria, and worth noting that this is one of those where Israel has not confirmed it. It's not saying whether or not they did this, whereas Syria is saying this absolutely was an Israeli strike. The argument as to why this is being done is that Iran is likely trying to ship munitions into those airports to be used with some of their militias in attacking Israel and potentially opening up another front. So it's not clear if this is Israel trying to get ahead of that and just making sure that airport is not usable, which, worth noting, it's a civilian airport, right? This isn't a military facility, but this is just the complexity of how some of these non-state actors are financed and resourced throughout the region. A lot of those weapons do come through commercial aircraft, kind of under the radar. So it's not clear if Israel is trying to get ahead of that, stopping that before it becomes a major issue, or if they've got intelligence that some of these arms are already on the way and that is happening, and they're trying to stem that as best they can. Now, moving to the United States response to all of this, which I have to say I think has been relatively measured at this point in a good way. We have had some folks in our government speak out pretty hawkishly about striking Iran and really escalating this war in a lot of different ways. But for the most part, from what I've seen, the U.S. government seems to be pretty level-handed at this point, not throwing accusations around left and right, and just kind of moving things into position as they might be needed. So Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin yesterday put out a statement saying, "I have directed the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group to begin moving to the Eastern Mediterranean as part of our effort to deter hostile actions against Israel or any efforts towards widening this war following Hamas's attack on Israel." He said the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group will join the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, which arrived earlier this week. So it's 2 carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's a lot of firepower. He said earlier this week, the U.S. Air Force announced deployment to the region of squadrons of F-15s, F-16s, and A-10 fighter aircraft, finishing by saying the increases to U.S. force posture signal the United States' ironclad commitment to Israel's security and our resolve to deter any state or non-state actor seeking to escalate this war. Now, I have seen some questions over the last few days about the possibility of direct U.S. involvement in this war. And personal opinion, I think we're 3 or 4 escalatory steps away from that even being in the conversation. I just don't think we're close right now. The only possibility in the short term, I don't think it would be crazy if U.S. Special Operations Forces were utilized as a part of some sort of hostage rescue in Gaza, if something like that were to materialize. I don't think that would necessarily be a large footprint or anything more than just getting the people out and moving on. But don't want to completely rule that out. Just, again, the fact that there are American hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza adds a lot of uncertainty here. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack once a week. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.